So, alright. This is the story about how I got into the sex work business about the first 2 weeks or so. I didn't do a very good job with my first client. I had done some research on the internet before I met him, and I learned a few things. The internet says that girl hookers are allowed to ask for the cash up front and that they can charge by the service. If a guy pays for a blowjob and then tries to stick it anywhere else, the lady's allowed to stop performing until he forks over more cash. The internet also told me that this is absolutely not the case if you were a boy hooker. In fact, the internet told me that boy hookers were more or less assumed to provide full service every single time. And the internet told me, above all, that no one likes a hooker who keeps checking the clock. The internet was totally wrong, by the way. Except for the clock watching part, that's true. I cleaned my apartment for several hours before I met my first client. I put on a new mix album. It was Saint Etienne's The Trip album, because the first disc is exactly 60 minutes long, and because it contains a lot of slower songs that an old person might like. I showered, and then I hung around looking at porn until the man came over, so I wouldn't have any trouble getting hard if he was a total toad. I was ready 45 minutes early. He was on time. He was an administrator with the school department in an adjacent city, he said, and he needed a quick blowjob before going home to his wife. He was old and not totally unattractive. I could do this. I offered him a drink and then pulled his pants down and then proceeded to give him a blowjob. I thought it would be best if I gave him a really good one, so he would come back again and again. A regular, you know, I had read about those on the internet. The only thing I didn't account for is that this aging public school administrator in a nearby town was really sexually frustrated and didn't really need any encouragement at all to get off. He lasted about 3 minutes. Then, feeling slightly cheated, I think, he gave me the money and took off, never to be seen again. My second client was a different story. I met him at a big historic hotel downtown. He had driven from Boston and was spending the night in Providence specifically to see me, because I looked more butch than any of the hairless Twinkie rent boys available in Boston. He had even asked me for hotel recommendations. I was simultaneously thrilled and terrified. Here I was, an escort, taking the elevator up to the 17th floor of the fanciest hotel on the National Historic Register. But also there he was, a total unknown behind a locked door, who, for all I knew, had horrible body odor, or worse. It turned out that I had nothing to worry about. He was handsome, athletic, in his late 30s, and very hairy, which I like. We were equally nervous, both being new to this, so we sat down on the hotel room sofa to talk before getting down to business. He told me that he lived in Washington but was staying in Boston for work. He was a lawyer in town to defend a bunch of elderly people that had been victimized in some kind of shady insurance scam that drained them of their life savings. He seemed very serious, and I liked that. At the time, I didn't really know anyone that was very serious about anything worth being serious about, let alone something really noble like getting old people's pensions back. Eventually, we moved on to some touching and some light to medium petting, and then he asked to see my hand. He held it up to his like you do when you're a kid and you want to see whose fingers are bigger. Our hands were basically the same size. You know what they say about big hands, he said, finally pulling his pants down so we could get the show started. It was a line that he had clearly used before, though probably on women who actually do have small hands. But regardless, it's what the two of us needed to get going. His legs were really nice, but more notably, this earnest lawyer had unquestionably the single largest penis I have ever beheld. And at this point in my life, I am not unaccustomed to beholding penises. It was, I would soon discover, the only one I've ever been physically unable to fit all the way into my mouth. I pulled my dick out, and his big hands metaphor suddenly didn't make any sense. but he didn't seem to mind. I gave this man a blowjob that both fascinated and disappointed me. "Come on, Lawrence, man up, you can get it down," I said to myself. "Give it the old college try, you can do it." This man wasn't even necessarily interested in having his dick swallowed, but I saw it as a fun challenge and sort of briefly forgot about the rest of him. But I couldn't do it. I was afraid I would bite him or puke or something. But judging from the man's reactions, I clearly did better than most other people. He reciprocated, and that was nice. Then he asked if we could switch to anal. I thought about it. And I decided I couldn't. Nobody ever really asks me to bottom, and I was totally out of practice. And I wasn't convinced that any amount of lube would allow that thing to fit inside me. The man understood. He told me, actually, that before their divorce, his second wife's gynecologist had told her to stop having sex with him because he was damaging her. This made me feel really bad for the man. Here he was, spending his days trying to prevent the elderly from losing their life savings, and he couldn't even go home to get laid afterwards. Eventually, he got off from the blowjob, and I jerked off on myself. He was in no hurry, and I was still so fascinated by everything that I didn't particularly take my time to get out of there. I've never been inside this particular hotel before, although I had recommended it as though it was my favorite place to stay. The man talked more about Boston and Washington, and about his divorce from his second wife, and about being a lawyer. Eventually, it was time to go, though. I had overstayed my welcome, and this 1-hour session had suddenly gone for about 90 minutes. He went to get his wallet, shoved some cash into an envelope, and handed it to me as I looked around the room for my socks. "This is what we talked about," he said, which was totally a lie because I am terrible at talking about money, and actually we hadn't talked about it at all. But my plan was to ask for $150, and when I saw the wad of money go into the envelope, I figured I'd be okay. When I left the room and got into the elevator, I pulled out the cash, secretly hoping that a security camera might see me. I counted it. $440. An odd amount, sure, but an amount this high-powered attorney could surely afford. On my walk home, I tried to figure out whether the firm was paying for my services anyway. In any case, I decided that escorting was a pretty good idea. Thank you.